Good morning. Thanks so much for having me and for inviting our blog and then being okay for a non-scientist to come speak to you. So I'm going to talk a little bit about using art and design to bridge the gap between scientific understanding and what the public hears and thinks. So BuzzSuit Roar is a graphics-driven blog. We have lots of illustrators who work with us, and we have one writer primarily who writes about concepts in 300 words or less. And we're made up of 3 organizers. We have an editor, a designer, that's me, and a writer. And Eleanor Spicer Rice is our main writer. She's an entomologist by training, and she works as a science writer in her day job. And I'm a graphic designer. My day job is doing user experience design for IBM. And beyond that, I've worked a lot in art and design education, developing programming for high schoolers. So that's me. So we've heard a little bit about this gap between public understanding and scientific inquiry, and I don't think that I necessarily need to frame it any more than it's already been framed. But we feel like it doesn't have to be that way. Here are a couple examples. So Ebola and climate change. And there's this blog post that we found to be really motivating. And I'll just read it really quickly, or part of it. So I'm not sure what we can or should offer in place of business as usual behavior, but I've noticed that being right isn't the same as being influential. I wonder how we can better advance the cause of science for the sake of public health at a minimum, to an audience drawn more to passion than to substance. That's Val Jones from Science-Based Medicine. And the part about being right versus being influential is really, problematic. Like, that's an issue, and we don't think it needs to be that way because good science is great content. So there's so much wonderful work happening out there, and we want to figure out ways to get it, a further reach. So Eleanor made this chart. It's the likeliness of us reading your paper. So you can see it goes way up the more graphs and figures you have, and if they're in color, even better. So beyond graphs and figures, what are some other ways that we can get people really excited about the research you guys are all doing? Since the Middle Ages, illustration and visual aids have been a big part of science. And we think that not just as a visual aid, but actually as art and design, so kind of going beyond that is a really good way to communicate your great content to a wide and diverse audience. And I want to talk a little bit about our audience because it wasn't something that we defined from the get-go, and we're still kind of defining what that is. We haven't said, this is for K through 12, or this is for teachers, or this is for other scientists, and it's evolving as we go. And I think that that's something I would never advise as a designer to do, to not know who your audience is, but it's kind of worked so far. So images can attract readers, so they're essential for us when we're publicizing what we're doing. So Facebook has actually been our biggest draw. And so having an image there is pretty essential. Otherwise, it would just really be overlooked. Images can also retain interest. So once someone gets to our site, it's what keeps them there. And then finally, it explains the content. So it's doing the hard work. It's unpacking a pretty complex concept and making it really, hopefully, palatable and interesting. So as I mentioned, I'm a graphic designer, so I'm going to talk a little bit about ways we use images and how we can measure if we think they're working. So this is an experience design model, and it was developed at Xerox in the 80s. And there's a lot of things going on there, but I think what's most exciting is this idea of reverberating. So the image is compelling, and it is helping someone understand something. Hopefully it's something that sticks with them, but then it reverberates. So that is kind of the social media aspect. We have this great image, and then it's being broadcast, as we've heard happens. And then these are some image functions. I'm not going to read all of them, but they're developed by Matthew Peterson, who is a professor of mine and now works at the University of Illinois at Champaign-Urbana. And he's trying to create a taxonomy of ways images do work. There's some that we use a lot. So the computational, which is, it translates really well to science imagery. It's assessing a difference between quantity or scale. So you can use it for rhetorical effect or humor, or really to just show the information. Narrative is another one we use often. So it's not necessarily a story, but it's showing the passage of time. And constitutive over here. So this is when there's a concept that really can't be explained verbally. So an exploded diagram is a good example of that. And then I'd be remiss to not talk about Scott McCloud's Understanding Comics when talking about imagery for communication. And he defines the idea of closure, which is what happens in between frames, and it's what the user brings to the table when they're understanding an image. And there's something we talk about in graphic design, that the life of an image only exists when it's being read by someone. So it's really only something that works at that moment. But what's really exciting to me is the idea that the audience is a willing and conscious collaborator. And that's why images sometimes stick more, because people bring their own experience, their education, and their imagination to it. So it becomes a really personal experience that's about them. These are some types of closure. So in comics, they can be moment to moment, action to action, subject to subject, scene to scene, etc. So Buzz Hoot Roar, we're a large team, three people at its core, and then we've had 23 illustrators so far in our first year, and I think 3 or 4 guest writers. We choose topics because we're personally interested in them, or for some arbitrary reason we've decided that people will like it. We're not always right in that. It's mildly controversial, or it's timely. And these are some examples of how we've translated, or our artists have translated, a graph into an image. So on the left, this is the regional seismic song differences in Sky Island populations of the jumping spider. And then on the left, Christine Fleming took that, and you can see there's 2 spiders on this far hill here, and then 1 spider here, and he is singing a little Justin Timberlake to that faraway spider. Here, this is about sensitivity to ladybugs. So Neil McCoy, who's actually one of our founders, he translated that. There's a heap of ladybugs compared to a cat, and then over here you can see the percentage and how there's equivalent there. And another thing that's really important to us, and it happens to be that Eleanor, who writes for us, is hilarious and fun, so that usually comes through in the content that she creates for us. But we have this post about woodpeckers and headbanging. And so this is pretty clear, it's not that different, the illustration on the left from the paper, and then what our artist, Joshua Ropsey, did on the left, but he added the heavy metal band named Weak Skulls. We don't have the same protections that woodpeckers have. And then applying Peterson's image function. This is a way that we can kind of see if an image is working. Is it doing work? And I think that the more types of functions in one image, the stronger it can be, so it's doing more work. This is by Christine Fleming, who's our current artist in residence, and it's about how many does it take. So the Eiffel Tower is this many sauropods tall. And it's computational in that we're using quantities to show scale, and it's comparative, so it involves the reader in assessing differences in similar entities, either in parts or in sets. Another example, this is about conflicts between elephants and people in India. So Betsy Peters-Rasco is using leaves to show crop damage in elephants versus a person. And this is actually our first Buzz Hoot Roar post. Eleanor drew it. It's a lot looser than maybe our newer things. They were a little bit more polished. And this is about squirrel warbles. So it really kind of captures what we do. It's pretty cute. It's definitely kind of gross. It's a little funny. And it's narrative, so there's a flow. It's showing the whole process of how squirrel warbles happen. It also has sort of an exploded view there, which is something that would be challenging to present with only words. And it's exploratory, which means there's a lot of depth there, and it takes the user through a path where they kind of have to digest all that to get the greater meaning. This is a more comic book style by Devin Kremen about tree rings, and it's narrative. So she had a whole story illustrating someone educating someone else about tree rings. And this is a reflexive example. So it's making the reader aware of its material means of existence. And if you probably can't see at the bottom here, but the fish is reading Buzz Toot Roar on an iPad. And it says, mammals like mice and you and me, unless you're a fish reading this, if that's the case, I apologize for generalizing about our audience and commend you on your literacy. So those are the ways we use images. They're illustration-based, sometimes they're infographic style, but there's all kinds of ways to use images to show your work or to get someone involved. So Morgan Jackson, who everyone knows here, uses photography to show insects as individuals, or at least that's how we've interpreted it. So, this fruit fly might be something that a regular person would just think as a nuisance, but up close you see that it's beautiful, you see it has a personality. And Alex Weil does that as well. So it's a viewpoint you don't usually see. You're getting more information about it, so what it actually looks like, and it's a beautiful photo, so that's insightful as well. Glendon Mello at the Flying Trilobite makes these really beautiful paintings that I think are often about evolutionary biology, which is something I don't know anything about, but I find really beautiful and captivating, and it makes me want to learn more. And then Natalie Sapinka has fish.com, and she uses imagery. It's not often her own. This is a painting by Nancy Tiles, and she pairs them with poetry to help people learn about fish. So it makes it really palatable, it's easy, and memorable. So we've been so fortunate to work with all kinds of artists in this first year, and we look forward to continuing with more. And I wrote a few of them to see how they felt about working with us or about doing science illustration, and some of them had never done it before. So Christine Fleming is our current artist in residence. She's been doing a lot of really great pieces for us. I'm not going to read it all, but she points out that she's kind of a mediator between the scientist and the layperson, which is similar to how I feel at our site. Since I'm not a scientist, if it makes sense to me, it's a pretty good judge of its effectiveness. And she also talks about when someone learns something and immediately wants to share it with others, it's awesome to be part of the chain of learning from the scientist to the illustrator to the reader and on to all their connections. Julia Rice has done 2 posts for us, and she talks about as we get older, we lose our scientific curiosity, or some of us who aren't scientists do, and we no longer feel like we're scientists. She says when we're in grade school, everyone is a scientist, at least in science class, and for many of us, we kind of get away from that. And she likes focusing simultaneously on science and design, making sure your pieces are technically accurate enough, and that they really get the message across in a way that makes the average person stop and say, oh wow, what's going on there? This is science, I'm so into it. And then Katie McKissick, who gave a really great talk yesterday in the comics section, she talks about helping people see that science is not scary or boring or intimidating, but instead it's interesting, fun, and sometimes even funny. And she loves it when people read one of her comics and say, wow, I never knew that. And so this is the Spider Did Not Bite You post that we had that was pretty controversial, or at least in the comment section. And sometimes personal experience still trumps the data. So in that example, the science is definitely there, but we got lots of comments about people's cousins who have been bitten, or some other personal anecdote that they had that, is going to be what they ultimately believe. And there's a really great comment down here that says, Witness the bite? Are you kidding? This is the prob with the entire country. Are you a spider lawyer? So moving forward, we'd like to have even more collaboration, so not only with artists, but with people who are doing research and have things that haven't come to our attention yet, really compelling content that people would like illustrated, and better metrics. So that's the one thing we aren't sure of. We feel like it's making a difference, but how do we measure that success on a small scale? So is an image doing what we think it does? Is it clear? Do people understand it? And how do we measure success on a grand scale? Does illustrated science increase literacy or help change public opinion? So we're still trying to figure out ways to do that. Right now, the only metrics we really have are Google Analytics, which just shows hits. It doesn't show comprehension. So thanks so much for having me. These are a lot of my collaborators on the blog, and I really appreciated being here.